I discovered my therapist was my ex-wife's friend, feeding her information about my mental state. The divorce papers were finalized on a Tuesday, and by Thursday I was sitting in a beige waiting room with motivational posters that looked like they were bought at a garage sale. The receptionist had this way of looking at you like she could see right through your soul, which honestly made me more nervous than the actual appointment itself. I'd been putting off getting help for months, but when you find yourself crying in the cereal aisle of the grocery store because you can't decide between Cheerios and Frosted Flakes, you know it's time to do something about your mental health. My first session with her went better than I expected, considering I'd never done anything like this before. She had this warm, understanding voice that made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely losing my mind after all. The office smelled like lavender and had these soft lighting fixtures that made everything feel safe and comfortable. I told her about the sleepless nights, the way my appetite had disappeared, and how I couldn't seem to focus on anything for more than 5 minutes at a time. She asked me about my marriage, and I found myself opening up about things I'd never told anyone. How my ex-wife had this way of making me feel like I was never good enough, always finding fault in everything I did. The way she'd criticize my cooking, my driving, even the way I folded the laundry. I talked about how isolated I felt toward the end, like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. Week after week, I kept coming back, and slowly I started to feel like maybe there was hope for me after all. She gave me exercises to do at home, ways to manage my anxiety, and helped me understand that what I was feeling was normal for someone going through a major life change. I started sleeping better, eating regular meals again, and even began thinking about maybe dating someday in the distant future. But then weird things started happening that I couldn't quite put my finger on. My ex-wife would text me out of nowhere, asking about specific things I'd only discussed in my sessions. She'd mention my new apartment, which I'd only talked about with my therapist and a couple of close friends. She'd ask about my job situation with this knowing tone that made my skin crawl. At first, I thought it was just coincidence or maybe she was hearing things through mutual friends. We'd been married for 8 years, so we knew a lot of the same people. But the questions got more specific, more personal. She'd ask about my sleep patterns, my eating habits, things that felt too intimate for casual conversation between exes. The breaking point came when she sent me a text asking if I was still having nightmares about the car accident from my childhood. That was something I'd only ever told one person outside of my family, and that was my therapist. I'd shared that story during our fourth session, talking about how it still affected my anxiety around driving. There was no way my ex-wife could have known about that unless someone had told her. I started paying more attention to the details during my sessions, looking for clues I might have missed. The way my therapist would sometimes pause when I mentioned certain things, like she was taking mental notes. How she'd ask follow-up questions about my ex-wife that seemed to go beyond professional curiosity. The way she'd nod knowingly when I talked about specific incidents from my marriage. One afternoon, I decided to leave my session early and wait in the parking lot to see who came and went. I felt like a creep doing it, but I needed to know if my suspicions were justified. After about 20 minutes, I saw a familiar car pull into the lot. My heart sank when I recognized it immediately. It was my ex-wife's silver sedan with the dent in the passenger door from when she'd hit a shopping cart 2 years ago. I watched her walk into the building, and my mind started racing with possibilities. Maybe she was seeing someone in the same practice for her own issues. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The timing was too perfect, and all those specific questions suddenly made sense. I waited another hour, watching through my rearview mirror as people came and went. When my ex-wife finally emerged, she wasn't alone. She was walking with my therapist, and they were laughing like old friends. They hugged goodbye in the parking lot, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized what had been happening all along. The next week, I went to my appointment armed with a plan. I made up a story about a fictional incident, something that had never happened but was detailed enough to sound believable. I told my therapist about how I'd run into my ex-wife at the coffee shop, and she'd made some comment about my new hobby of collecting vintage records. The truth was, I'd never collected records in my life, but I wanted to see if this fake information would somehow make its way back to my ex-wife. Sure enough, 3 days later, I got a text from my ex asking about my record collection and whether I'd found any good albums lately. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This woman I'd trusted with my deepest fears and insecurities had been sharing everything with the person who'd caused most of my emotional damage in the first place. I spent the rest of the week trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Part of me wanted to confront my therapist directly, but I knew she'd probably just deny it or claim client confidentiality. Part of me wanted to report her to whatever board oversees these things, but I wasn't sure if I had enough proof. Mostly, I just felt violated and stupid for trusting someone who'd been playing me all along. Instead of confronting her directly, I decided to set up a more elaborate test. I created a fake social media profile and started following both my ex-wife and several of her friends. I wanted to see if I could find any connection between them that would explain how they knew each other. It took some digging, but eventually I found what I was looking for. There were photos going back years of my ex-wife and my therapist at various social events. Birthday parties, holiday gatherings, girls' nights out. They weren't just acquaintances, they were close friends. I felt sick looking at the pictures, realizing that every session I'd attended was probably being dissected and analyzed by my ex-wife later that same day. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how calculated the whole thing had been. My ex-wife had probably recommended this particular therapist to me, though she'd done it so subtly that I thought it was my own idea. She'd mentioned the practice in passing, how she'd heard good things about their approach. I'd been so desperate for help that I'd grabbed onto any suggestion. I started remembering specific moments from our marriage that suddenly made more sense. The way my ex-wife seemed to know exactly which buttons to push to make me feel worthless. How she'd bring up my insecurities at the worst possible moments. If she'd been getting inside information about my mental state from a professional, she'd have known exactly how to manipulate me. The betrayal felt deeper than anything I'd experienced during the divorce. At least then, I'd known we were adversaries. This felt like being stabbed in the back by someone I'd trusted with my most vulnerable moments. I'd paid this woman to help me heal, and instead she'd been weaponizing my pain for someone else's benefit. I decided to confront my ex-wife first, figuring she might be more likely to admit what had been happening. I called her and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss some practical matters about our divorce settlement. She agreed, probably thinking she'd get more ammunition for whatever game she was playing. When I brought up the therapist situation, her face went through a series of expressions that told me everything I needed to know. First confusion, then panic, then this defiant look like she was trying to decide whether to keep lying or come clean. She finally admitted that yes, they were friends, and yes, she'd been getting updates on my sessions. Her justification was that she was worried about me and wanted to make sure I was getting the help I needed. She claimed she'd never asked for specific details, that my therapist had volunteered the information out of concern for my well-being. Even if that were true, which I doubted, it didn't make the betrayal any less painful. I told her I was considering taking legal action against both of them, and that seemed to shake her more than anything else I'd said. She started backpedaling, claiming the whole thing had been a misunderstanding and that she'd never meant to hurt me. She promised to stop contacting the therapist and to leave me alone to heal in peace. But the damage was already done. Every breakthrough I thought I'd made in therapy now felt tainted. Every moment of vulnerability I'd shared felt like it had been turned into entertainment for the person who'd hurt me most. I couldn't trust my own memories of the sessions, wondering what had been genuine help and what had been fishing for information. I found a new therapist across town, someone with no connection to my ex-wife or her social circle. Starting over felt overwhelming, but I knew I needed professional help to process not just my divorce but this additional betrayal. The new therapist was shocked when I told her what had happened and assured me that what my previous therapist had done was completely unethical. It took months to rebuild my trust in the therapeutic process. Every session with my new therapist felt like walking on thin ice, wondering if this person was also going to betray my confidence. I found myself holding back, not sharing the deepest stuff because I was terrified of being vulnerable again. It was like learning to swim after nearly drowning. Technically, you know how to do it, but the fear never quite goes away. The legal route turned out to be more complicated than I'd hoped. While what my former therapist had done was clearly unethical, proving it in court would be difficult without recorded conversations or written evidence. I filed complaints with the state licensing board and the professional association, but those processes move slowly and don't provide much satisfaction when you're dealing with the immediate emotional fallout. What helped more than any legal action was slowly rebuilding my sense of self-worth. I started doing things I'd enjoyed before my marriage, reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with, and focusing on my own healing without worrying about what anyone else might think. I took up hiking, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was trying to manage my ex-wife's constant demands. The mountains became my real therapy. There's something about being alone with your thoughts in nature that helps put everything in perspective. I'd spend hours walking trails, processing everything that had happened and slowly learning to trust my own judgment again. It was during one of these hikes that I realized I'd been giving my ex-wife too much power over my emotional state. I also started journaling, something my new therapist had suggested but I'd been resistant to at first. Writing down my thoughts and feelings helped me see patterns I'd missed before. I could track my progress more objectively and celebrate small victories that might have gone unnoticed otherwise. It became a safe space where I could be completely honest without fear of judgment or betrayal. Eventually, I reached out to a few other people who'd been through similar situations. There's apparently a whole online community of people who have experienced betrayals in therapy, and knowing I wasn't alone helped more than I'd expected. We shared stories, coping strategies, and resources for finding trustworthy practitioners. It was like having a support group of people who understood exactly what I was going through. The hardest part was learning to forgive myself for being so trusting. I kept beating myself up for not seeing the signs earlier, for being naive enough to believe that someone in a helping profession would actually want to help me. My new therapist helped me understand that trusting others isn't a weakness, it's what makes us human. The problem wasn't that I'd been too trusting, but that two people had chosen to abuse that trust. About a year after everything came to light, I got a call from the licensing board saying they'd completed their investigation. My former therapist had lost her license and would no longer be able to practice. It felt like a hollow victory. Nothing could undo the damage she'd caused, but at least she wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else the same way. I never heard from my ex-wife again after our confrontation at the coffee shop. Part of me wondered if she'd found other ways to keep tabs on me, but I realized I couldn't live my life constantly looking over my shoulder. I had to trust that I'd learned to recognize the warning signs and that I was strong enough to handle whatever came next. The experience taught me that healing isn't linear, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to help you will let you down in the worst possible ways. But it also showed me that I'm more resilient than I thought, and that I can survive betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. I learned to trust my instincts again, to speak up when something doesn't feel right, and to prioritize my own well-being over other people's expectations. Now when I tell people about what happened, they're always shocked that a medical professional would do something so unethical. But I've learned that predators exist in every profession, and that having advanced degrees doesn't make someone immune to corruption. The important thing is to trust your gut when something feels wrong, and to have the courage to walk away from situations that aren't serving you. I still go to therapy, but now I interview potential therapists like I'm hiring them for a job. I ask about their policies on confidentiality, their connections to my social circle, and their approach to boundaries. It might seem paranoid, but I'd rather be overly cautious than naive again. My mental health is too important to leave to chance. The whole experience changed how I approach relationships in general. I'm more selective about who I trust with personal information, and I pay closer attention to people's actions rather than just their words. I've learned that someone can say all the right things while doing all the wrong things behind your back. It's made me a more skeptical person, but also a more self-reliant one. Looking back, I can see that this betrayal was actually a gift in disguise. It forced me to develop my own coping mechanisms and to stop relying on others to fix my problems. I learned that I'm capable of healing myself with the right support and tools. I'm not the same person I was when I first walked into that beige waiting room, and I'm grateful for that transformation even though it came at such a high cost. The trust issues took longer to resolve than the original problems that brought me to therapy in the first place. But working through them made me a stronger, more confident person. I know now that I can handle whatever life throws at me, and that I don't need anyone else's validation to know my own worth. That's a lesson I never would have learned if everything had gone according to plan.